All right. This Tuesday workshop at Thinker Growth Business Accelerator community. Good morning, Mr. Paul Edwards, my co-faculty member.
Morning, Jason Todd.
Always a pleasure to see you, sir. Today,
Hi.
we're talking about mission to marketplace or ministry to marketplace, however you want to think about that. Sparked off from a conversation I had yesterday with Bernie, who I believe is going to be on here shortly. And he spent a decade in the mission field, having come from the marketplace in primarily project management roles. And now he's looking to transition back into the marketplace. In fact, here he's coming in. I just admitted him to the room. So while that's happening, talking about mission to marketplace, part of why this topic is intriguing and important. Bernie's down in Cape Town, South Africa. Bernie, why don't you go ahead and give us some background on what you're talking about in this idea of ministry to marketplace, making that transition. Where are you at with that, and why is this topic important to you?
So we've been preaching the gospel for 20 years. We've been doing it full time for 10 years. We've just seen that there's such a massive need, and we're just not able to fulfill the need with where we're at right now. So we are looking to get into the marketplace to generate revenue so that we can fund projects that we would like to do to help people that need the help. And our journey has been very intentional. The Lord spoke very specifically to us when he told us to go full time. He gave us Matthew 6:33, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And he also gave us, freely you've received, so freely you will give. And his instructions to me were that we have to live by faith. We're not to charge for any services. So it doesn't matter whether you're doing church, counseling, funerals, weddings, doesn't matter what you're doing. You're not charging for anything. Itinerant, ministering. So we've literally had to live by faith and trust God. When he called us, he told us to register a nonprofit organization as well as a for-profit organization. But the focus for the first 10 years has been purely ministry. And I know ministry, I don't really like this ministry business because it's actually your life. It's who you are. It's everything that you do. It's all encompassing. You can't really split them. It's not what you do. It's what you be and who you are. But I believe the Lord had to take us on this journey to just teach us things that he needed to teach us, which he wouldn't have been able to do in any other sort of environment. I personally feel going into business almost like a next level of faith, because now you're not just trusting God you're trusting God for a lot more. Or maybe it's just a different dimension or aspect to faith. So that's where we are right now. And it's, like I said, I've been out the marketplace for 10 years. And if I look at my LinkedIn profile and the things that I've done, I don't even recognize that person anymore. So it's quite a big shift for me personally. And just trying to search, how do I just get back? How do I not get back, but just get to what the Lord wants me to do in the marketplace?
You talked about your journey of faith in missions work being somehow unique. You learned some things in there. Can you unpack that? Would you be willing to unpack that for us?
Well, I just think there's a difference. There's a difference to having a church and having people tithing into your ministry every month. We haven't had that. We haven't had income. We haven't had a salary from a church. So our journey has really just been faith journey. There's been times here and there where the Lord's maybe opened up a door for my wife to do a half-day job or something like that. And it's always been for a specific reason. It's a very different type of lifestyle, not knowing where your food's coming from tomorrow, or your petrol, or how you're going to pay your kids' school fees, it's not the normal ministry model. It was, the Lord really demanded, not demanded, he asked us, he gave us a choice. We could have said no if we wanted to. But it demanded of us a high level of faith to operate like that, especially being a family of 4. I don't think it's different to say you live by faith. If you If you're in ministry, but you're getting a salary every month and you get tithes coming in and you get people donating into projects. But if you just have nothing and it's purely trusting in God, yeah, it's very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable. But it teaches you grit and it teaches you guts and it really teaches you to trust God and trust in His provision. I've said to the Lord many times, Lord, you've never seen the righteousness forsaken nor His seed begging for bread. And I can't say that we've ever begged for bread. The Lord's always met our needs in some way or the other. Yeah, I can tell you so many stories I can tell you. But obviously, doing that for 10 years, we're going to have stories.
Mm. Yeah, 10 years living in that method it is, maybe it perhaps feels like a departure from the marketplace. But I think many times in the entrepreneurial journey, it feels much the same way. Let's first start businesses. It's like, where's my next meal coming from as I'm out
Yes.
hustling to go get the business off the ground? Paul, you have some thoughts on this?
I was just curious, Bernie, you don't need to get into the super nitty gritty, but what kind of work are you doing in the nonprofit world? What are you doing for people?
So our ministry has been a very strange one. Our ministry has been very much personal relationships with people. It hasn't really been establishing like a massive work, like building an orphanage so we've done home church for many years. At the moment, we have a church every Sunday in one of the rural areas at a shelter. And we've just really built up a lot of connections, relationships, network. So our ministry's been very relational. I don't think it hasn't been so much about building something. I think it's more been about building us as people and for whatever the Lord wants to do with us. He has downloaded a vision to us, which I do have in a presentation form, which I can show you guys sometime if you're interested, if you want to see what that's about. But yeah, generally, and then we have feeding schemes. There's some old people that we look after. It's not big things. It's bread and milk, eggs. It's the necessities.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people really struggling. And in South Africa, I'm not into politics and stuff. I love all people. But we just deal with some real issues here that since apartheid changed, which was a good thing, the focus of the government's really been on the African people, the Black African people.
Mm-hmm.
And the area that we live in, which is the Western Cape, we've got what you call colored people or brown people, which is a mixture between the white and the black, or white and Chinese, or some mix. And so the area I live in, Cape Town, that's the prominent people here. So the charities and stuff focus a lot on the brown people. And there's a lot of white people that are neglected. So we have tried to prioritize on some level some of the white people as well, just because they do get overlooked. So there's a lot of families that they're living under the breadline. They've got disabled children. And our government grants that the old people get here is 1,600 Rand. So to put that into perspective, it's $80 that you live on every month.
Yeah, nothing. Yeah.
It's very difficult. So yeah, that is just, we try and help families wherever we can every month with what we've got. And any money that we do get in, we then use a tithe off of that, and we use that money then to help wherever we can.
Mm.
And then we offer obviously spiritual guidance yeah.
So providing people with a community that they otherwise wouldn't have one, they'd just live isolated and
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we started some stuff like feeding scheme now that's about one ton of dozen that come in every 2 weeks, and then we distribute that in the community. I've handed that over to someone else now that's running with it. But yeah, so we're just involved in a lot of different places with like Meals on Wheels, and with the Baptist Church, and with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and with the Old Apostolic Church, and wherever we can lend a hand, we lend a hand and just support. But I would say our main sort of, I don't want to call it a charity, but our main connection has just been more the homeless and the shelters, and just trying to give them hope and dignity, because they've they lose hope, they lose dignity, they lose their self-worth, they lose their identity because they've just been living a hard life for so long.
Yes.
And it's just to offer them encouragement and just to say, hey, you know what? It doesn't matter if you're living on the streets. God created you for a reason. You've got a call on your life. And just to start giving them the word and build their faith. And we've had success. We've had people that have left the shelters, that have found jobs, that have managed to get into old age homes. And it's not big stuff, but it's for that person, it's big.
Well, I'm taking it all in, and I'm silently lamenting as a grandson of South Africa. My mom was from Johannesburg, and I know all about. I was told volumes of what a disaster it's become compared to what it was. Not that the apartheid was at all justified. I'm not defending that, but that country used to be an economic powerhouse.
Yeah.
Where poverty was very low, and unfortunately, the pursuit of life outside of God leads to hardship and deprivation. It's written right there in the Torah. It's guaranteed. You pursue life apart from connection to Him. You pursue organizing a society without living off of His precepts, and you're going to pay a pretty penny for it. And it's just the natural outflow of it. But one thing that occurred, where I think I see some hope, if you have survived for this long in the nonprofit world doing this, who knows what profit is, not what profit, but what possibilities can await you in the for-profit side of things. And the reason I say that, of course, is that providing people with a community and a place of belonging is great. Providing them with a place of community and belonging and an occupation that pays their bills is even better.
Yes.
In my opinion. And
Yes,
my thought is that if you've cultivated this skill of being that hub where so many people turn to for resources and help and direction and advice and all that sort of thing, and you then go and duplicate that among people who have resources to throw at it. And I don't mean throw at it in a reckless sense, but who have some weight to bring on it. And I just say this from personal experience, from having been exited serving in the military, and things didn't work out for me. And I ended up having to go to work in the insurance business, which I had no connection to, no interest in, no family history, and no familiarity with whatsoever. I learned to network there, though. I learned because people don't want to talk about insurance, and so I had to find something else to talk about. And I built this groundswell of support and friendship and goodwill and relationships, and it's benefited me in so many different ways that I'm now recently relocated to Arizona in the southwestern U.S. I'm getting set to do it again. Why? Because I know I need one. I know I need a network. And I also know that by going out and being a go-giver, I don't know if you've ever read that book by Bob Berg, but I know that by going out and being a go-giver, being generous with your time, your resources, your connections, the people you know, introductions, God's kingdom is designed to work on cooperation and reciprocity between His children. There's no other way it works. And He's going to see to it that comes back to you in spades. And you start doing it among people who have resources. I think you'll see rather quickly that you can begin to pour some of that resources into the places you've been working for the last 10 years.
Yeah, look, I said to my wife this morning, because Jason said to me yesterday, can you write down 5 services? And I said to my wife, I hate it when people ask me that question. Because when you're in the marketplace, it's, you know what you're doing and you know what your background is and stuff, but things have changed so much. Like I said, I don't recognize the person I compared to where he was. And it almost, in terms of the marketplace, I've got to find myself in terms of just how do I translate the things I've learned in the last 10 years into my marketplace journey now, like you're saying. But so for me, the challenge is how do I identify what the strengths and the skill set that can actually create the revenue for me I've done the Gallup strength assessment. I don't know if you guys have heard of it before.
Oh, yeah.
And I've done a bit of transformational leadership through a South African organization called Transformational Leadership Institute. And you go through the whole sort of mapping your vision, mission, being a coach. We had CEO roundtables once a month. And so I've done these sort of businessy things in between. One of my best friends, he was an elderly gentleman. He was 73, passed away last year. But he had considerable wealth at some stage. He had the jets and the cars and the lifestyle. He worked all over the world. But when he was 40, he just gave everything away and he started living by faith. But I got to spend a couple of years with him, and he definitely imported a different way of thinking when it comes to business. Because when you operate at the billionaire level, I think you just got a different way of looking at stuff, thinking about things. But yeah, it still is challenging for me just to find my feet. And that is why I'm coming humbly and saying, I don't have the answers. I think one thing that we always have to be in the kingdom of God is teachable.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's anybody I can learn from, anyone that can mentor me, I don't care if they're younger than me, older than me, it doesn't matter. It's just, we can learn.
Paul, I want to circle back is the word. I want to circle back on something you said. The kingdom of God is built on, you said something in reciprocity. What were those words?
What word did I use? All of a sudden, I'm drawing a blank on it.
I thought it was a P word, but then the word perspective comes to mind, which doesn't make sense. It's something in reciprocity.
Generosity, I think.
Generosity, reciprocity?
I think so. It is. I know we talk about salvation being a free gift, but I also am aware that salvation comes with a list of requirements that we begin to adhere to after we receive it. It's not, in other words, a free gift that we say, okay, done, dusted, and then we go on with our lives. There is a change expected. There is a shift that you're supposed to go through. And therefore, it's not a one-way street. It's a two-way street. And the same principle holds true between each other. You can give and give until you're absolutely empty. But if you're not getting filled up in the other direction, it's sooner or later, it's going to counteract the cost. And so what I've learned is God intended right from the get-go that our existence, the success and thriving and health and all of that of our existence would be predicated on cooperation. And you can tell this by the fact that one of the first things he says to Adam is, by the sweat of your face, you shall eat bread. And I used to think that was a curse, but then if you slow down and think about it, bread is a uniquely human type of food. No animal cooperates with other animals to manufacture a food. Somebody has to plant the grain, somebody has to farm it, somebody has to pull it up, somebody has to, thresh it, and somebody has to mold it and bake it, and somebody has to truck it to a grocery store, somebody has to sell it before we buy it. It's all based on cooperation. We eat bread because other people help to make the bread. Right from the get-go, God is saying, the way this world is going to work is if all of you cooperate and help each other. If it happens to go on to the prophets, so be it. No disrespect to nonprofits, right? But nonprofits get their money from somewhere. It doesn't grow on trees. So the for-profit sector has to be involved. And if God's telling you go back to the for-profit sector, I say go with gusto.
One of the thoughts comes to my mind is about a friend of mine years ago. His name was Tom. And unfortunately, he passed too early. I think he was like late 30s or something like that. And I had been helping him out at a church startup that he had been doing for a couple of years. He was also a service underwriter at a local car place, right? So if you need your car fixed, you go in there and he'd sell you the stuff that you need in terms of service. But he had this heart for ministry, and he was a trained pastor. And when he started in with this idea about really doubling down on his church and going in as a startup, he was struggling because he didn't have enough people. There was a lot of effort, and yet he was finding success at work, right? So when he was talking to the leadership of the church, which I was helping him out with, I said, you really need to just go all in on this thing as a startup and rally all the troops. Everybody's just going to double down for the next year or two to really grow this church and get the word out that you even exist. Or it's just going to be you. It's going to be this continual struggle. And he agreed. And in talking to the community that had built that church, they all said, we're not ready to double down on this. Maybe we could join up with another church. So they started pursuing that, merging with another church that was in town. At the same time, my buddy got an offer to buy a car dealership with an attached service center. So he decided to do that. And when he was talking to me, he was on the fence. Do I go through this ministry thing or do I pursue the car thing full time? What do I do? And I told him, I said, your heart is for a pastor. Why do you want to do that? And he said, I really want to engage with people and meet new people and tell them about the gospel. And my encouragement to him was, you don't need a church to do that. You just think that's the only way to get it done because you have some formal training in that framework of church. But if you really want to meet new people who need to hear the gospel, a car dealership / service center is one of the best ways to do that. You will meet new people every day who probably will never step foot in a church or have never stepped foot in a church or have left the church, and they're not going to just randomly walk into a church, but they do need their car fixed. So I told him, if you want to be a pastor, just to meet new people and spread the gospel, you can be a pastor at the service center. And sure enough, he did. The other church merged. His workload was a whole lot less than when he was plugging through full time on his own with support. And then he also had his stable income from his service center, and he met a lot of people. In fact, he named it, the name that he used was biblical in nature. And they became known for a period of time for their really high quality service. So I think on this journey from mission to marketplace, sometimes we get stuck in some sort of paradigm and say, or organizational structure and say, this is the way it has to be. When in fact, if we pull apart the heart for missions, there's all these component parts which can be applied in any sector at any time and we don't need to separate making money and doing missions from having a formal job.
The other thing that occurs to me, Bernie, is that physical poverty is much easier to spot than spiritual poverty, which may be to say that God is directing you into the marketplace because you have faithfully served those who are obviously impoverished. Now you may be getting promoted to serve those who are not so obviously impoverished, but as Revelation will point out, are in even worse straits because they don't think they are. Oh, I'm set. I got all the money and I don't need God. Whoa, hold on a second there, cousin. I think, and I'm not saying this is what you're thinking. I'm just throwing out ideas until something catches.
Yes.
But as you pointed out, you had that mentor who got to the very pinnacle of success and then realized this isn't enough. It doesn't scratch the itch. And that's where a lot of people in the Western world haven't yet figured it out. They are still trying to claw their way to the top, thinking that when they get there, they're finally going to be fulfilled and satisfied. And you can poke holes in that all day.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And point out to them, it's not going to scratch the itch. I'm all for people making more money. I'm all for people having as much to live on as possible. I want every single person on this planet to be healthy, wealthy, and wise. But if it comes at the cost of your soul, as Jesus said, what's the point?
Yeah, look, I mean, I can honestly say, you can speak to anybody that knows me. Money is definitely not my motive. The love of money is the root of all evil, not money itself. And the Lord spoke to me many years ago, 20 years ago, and he said to me that a lot of money will flow through my hands. And if you gave me $1 million 10 years ago, I wouldn't know what to do with it. If you gave me $1 million now, I know exactly what to do with it. And I also won't waste it. I think that we have to go on these journeys so that God can just prepare us for what needs to happen. Because what I've noticed because through my journeys, I have connected with business people, and because I'm I'd say like a gifting that God's given me is, and I think it's part of the prophetic, is that I can spot opportunities quite quickly, much quicker than other people can spot them. And often I'll put people together and they'll think I'm totally nuts. What is this guy's problem? Why are we sitting around this boardroom table? And then all of a sudden the light switch goes on or the light bulb appears above the head. And then the potential is seen and the potential for revenue is seen, and then people lose their heads. And I'm talking about Christians. I'm not talking about worldly people here. And I've seen it over and over. And it's ambition and competition's an ugly thing, and it doesn't belong in the body of Christ, and it doesn't belong in kingdom business. God created us to be all unique, and whatever God's put in me needs to will complement my brother, and whatever God's put in my brother will complement me. There's no competition between us, but I think sometimes money blurs those lines. And one thing the Lord said to me is that he said to me, my son, if you want to keep balance with money, he says, you always keep people your priority and your focus. He says, my currency is not money, it's my tool. He says, people are my currency. And that's where my heart is, and that's why I release the funds, and that's why I give the tools. And a person can lose focus on why you're doing what you're doing when the money starts rolling in, and you can forget about the people. But if you can just keep that at the forefront, this is about God loving people, but it can keep the balance in your life with regards to that. You can just remind yourself about that.
You brought up an important verse, and I think one that it's worth reading around and with, because there's some people who might be watching this or listening to this who don't have a scriptural background. So you said the money is the root of all evil, and we know that verse. And so it's in 1 Timothy 9 through 11. We're just going to read that. And this is in the ESV. So those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. But as for you, O man of God, flee these things. Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, and gentleness. And the reason I want to bring that up is because sometimes people who are finding themselves with a strong missional spirit, not unlike yourself or the lady who I've been conversing with on LinkedIn who'll join us in a workshop at some time in the future. She's got this mindset for missions because she's feeling, hey, I got to get out and do things. These might be the end times. She's got this heart. And yet we feel this tension because sometimes with that strong pull to the mission, we look at something like money and sometimes even subconsciously press it away instead of just knowing that it's a tool. It's out there, and it's not the root of all evil. It's the root of all kinds of evil, because that craving of it is a temptation, as though money is the thing that actually keeps us going in life, that we got to amass the money. We got to see it in our bank accounts. We have to know it's there. Otherwise our lives somehow are going to come to a dramatic end. It tends to get a lot of focus, when in fact, on the flip side, and years ago, I was at a church where the church was struggling with finances, but the church was also doing a lot of stuff that didn't seem to get a lot of engagement. It just seemed like stuff we were doing because one random person was like, you know what we should do? And I was okay, we'll try that. Right. And at one point in time, money's running short, and I was in leadership at the board. And I said, let's agree to something. And that is that anything that needs to get done, God's going to provide for it, because there are scriptures. Okay. We know that to be true. So then what? My first question was, what are we doing that we shouldn't be doing if there's no provision for it? And if we confronted that moment, it was like, if we shouldn't be doing this because there's no provision for it, the next question was, who's going to get upset when we stop doing whatever that service is or whatever that thing is in the church? And it was interesting because a lot of good information was uncovered when we took that question a step further and thought, okay, when we pull this, oh, actually, one of the underlying reasons why we don't pull it is because so and so is going to get upset, rather than this just isn't something to budget for. It's not in provision. We're not afraid of. We're not even afraid of asking for money for it. We've asked for money for other things, and now we've used up that, gone to that well too much, and now we're starting to suffer people a little too far. Paul.
Yeah, and when we like, I have a total appreciation for the way mission-driven people, and when I say mission, now we're talking specifically faith-driven missions to people who are not served or underserved or that kind of thing. I have a deep and abiding respect for that. I realize that wouldn't get done except for those people. And yet, I at the same time, I wonder, is it not equally our responsibility, if we are the possessors of resources and knowledge and all of that, to empower people to stand on their own 2 feet? And I have a great story of this. A year or so ago, I did some work for a group in Nigeria. They were US based, but they were ministering in Nigeria. And one of the things that had become very frustrating for the Nigerian people and for US and European based ministry groups wanting to go over there and help, seeing the plight of people, was the fact that there was no permanence to the work they did. It did not cause a dramatic shift. In fact, it turned out to be like putting a Band-Aid on a tumor. And so the specific work was the fact that was stemming from the fact that the Nigerian healthcare system is an absolute debacle, like 4th worst in the world. The doctors there have not been able to improve their technology or their facilities since the 1960s, when they declared independence from Great Britain. And so it might not cost a lot getting healthcare in Cuba. It's free, but you get what you pay for. So this group, US-based Nigerian immigrants, enjoyed some very lucrative success here. One of them played briefly in the NFL, and his sister became successful in the executive world. And so it's a brother and sister duo, and their parents are still their retirement age now, but for decades, they were missionaries, local missionaries in Nigeria. And they decided, okay, we're going to go do medicine in Nigeria, but we're not doing it the way typical American ministries do it. We're not sending a ship over there with a couple doctors going to stitch up a couple things, bandage things, give a couple shots and injections for 2 weeks, and then go back home. We can't do that because it doesn't last. The Nigerian people have to do this for themselves. They have to be taught how to do it. It has to be funded by American dollars, but it has to be done by Nigerians, and only by Nigerians, led by Nigerians, facilitated by Nigerians, received by Nigerians, and eventually paid for by Nigerians. And so they structured it differently. They said, okay, we're going to raise American dollars, and we're going to bring American doctors to train Nigerian doctors. Nigerian doctors are going to do the procedures. If there's anything that, that they're still halfway through their learning and beyond what they've experienced, okay, then the American doctors can step in and perform some of that. But other than that, the American doctors are there to train and train only. And the American dollars flow until a Nigerian hospital and Nigerian private practices are built separate from the Nigerian disaster healthcare system. And that's the only way we're going to do it. As much as we have a responsibility to care about people and to be compassionate and to reach out to them and help them when they're really suffering, we have an equal responsibility to teach them the principles that we have followed in the Judeo-Christian West to create the widespread prosperity that we have. It's not by accident. We didn't get it because this is a nicer land than that one over there. Right? We got it through setting up a society according to biblical principles. That is still, it's crumbling, but those principles are still built into our foundations today. And I think this is actually in Africa anyway. This is an opportune time for stuff like that because Africans have suffered long enough under the dictatorial regimes and thug rulers that they have. And Christianity is exploding across Africa. It's growing like wildfire in certain regions of it. And my hope is that a similar philosophy of how they should govern themselves, what the limits should be on the traditional corrupt regimes that they've had since the British left. I'm hoping that this takes years, decades, but I think there's a responsibility to those of us who carry the gospel, not merely to help people and bandage up their wounds, but also to teach them to care for themselves. And to do that, they need an income because they need to be able to stay alive and feed themselves while they're learning the skills. And so that income is going to come when there is a mutual profit in it for an employer and an employee to work together. Their history shows there really hasn't been any way. For exactly what you were saying there, Jason, if we only are doing it, if we're stuck in this paradigm, it can only be done through the church. We can't do it through an auto repair facility or whatever. I just haven't found that to be true.
Yeah, Jason, apologies. I moved to the study and I didn't realize that my wife always sits here and I didn't realize that the PowerPoint was off in my laptop.
No
It's
worries.
supposed to want me at 10%, but it just switched off. So I don't know why I did that. But anyway, I'd like to just understand because I heard now what Paul was saying, but obviously it was following on from what you said, but I missed you halfway through there. I would appreciate it if you are able to, if you can remember just where you were, just so I could hear what you had to say.
I probably can't remember. All
You
my
were talking about the ministry
my notes.
programs for which there was no funding and we should cut them
Oh,
and then
yeah.
he would be upset.
Yeah, at the church where we were struggling with budgets at one point in time. And my premise was that God provides for everything that needs to get done.
Yeah.
And if we don't have the provision for it, then there's something that we're not doing, or that we are doing that we shouldn't or don't need to be doing. Piggybacking off of what Paul's talking about and that recap, there's a group called Leadership Network. They're down in Texas, started by a great guy who was in business for many years. He owned some television stations, which then became cable stations. And then that spread out throughout the southern states. And he was a very successful individual. And along the way, he got this intense feeling he needed to go to the mission field. And he thought, I'm going to sell everything I have. We're talking tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars of stuff, right? He's going to sell this business. He's going to go to the mission field. And by virtue of the work that he had done, and he had cultivated a lot of influence. And so I believe he was talking to, I don't know, like Dobson or somebody, some spiritual leader, evangelical leader. It's just running it by him. And what do you think? I'm thinking of selling all my stuff and going to the mission field. And this other spiritual leader says, you're an idiot. I don't know if anybody told you that, but you're an idiot. It's the last thing you should do. Like, you have this heart for missions, but God didn't say, now go sell all your stuff and give it to the poor.
Yes.
He told that to one guy, not to everybody.
Yes.
So it's really interesting that you have that heart, but you need to now use or leverage your influence. You could call up the president right now and say, hey, I'd like to get a meeting with you, and he will take your meeting. Like, you don't throw this influence away. Instead, leverage it into your second half. And so this man, Bob Buford, wrote a book called Halftime, which is all about what you're doing in your first half, preparing you for your second half. But whether your second half is going to go great or not depends on what happens in the locker room at halftime. That's where the game is won or lost. Take all your learnings from the first half, recombobulate them, and apply them to the second half. Leadership Network invites churches from around the world or around the US and Canada and areas to their facility to talk about things like world missions. So we were down there talking about world missions, making twice the impact in half the time. One of the critical things we learned and talked about is a lot of times we want to fix other people's problems with the thing that probably is our problem. So in the United States, we idolize money, right? that verse we talked about before. It's the root of all sorts of evil, but it doesn't say you don't need money. You do need money. In fact, you should even pay to Caesar what is. But we will then take that money because we have a lot of it. You know what those people need? They need clothing. Let's send them some money. Let's send them clothing. We need to send them shoes. They obviously want some shoes because we want shoes. We like to have lots of shoes, and we need good shoes too. Shoes that are not broken down. We need to send some shoes. But unpacking this idea that we keep funding, and from the West, from the United States, let's say, we keep funding people's quote unquote needs around the world with the things of our excess.
Yeah.
Which has nothing at all to do with what they want or need or what is sustainable for them.
Yeah.
So we'll build a clean water project, but there's no, when that pump breaks down, there's no pump parts. That community is not going to go find a pump parts. And so now the community will glad hand each other and say, yay, we built clean water. And 2 years later, this whole thing is completely busted. Now that community is living off of clean water. There's no facility for dirty water now. And now, oops, sorry, we left you high and dry. We fixed things. We fixed things that aren't necessarily sustainable. So along this thread, what we learned was the most successful missions work is done in partnership with somebody who lives in that community. So funding is taken in small chunks and given, or even people power is given, time, resources, information to that individual or group who then works with indigenous leaders of that community for them to solve their own problems in a sustainable way. So it could be, for instance, that they use bike parts, or I know there was a project at one point in time that used old motorcycle parts instead of just buying beautiful pumps or whatever from the United States or from an established city. They use just motorcycle parts because motorcycles are breaking down all the time, and they can just use old parts from any old motorcycle to fix their pumps. That wouldn't be something that the United States would come up with, but it is something somebody who lives that life in that place would definitely come up with, given the space and given the resources to think about it. So it's this idea of partnership with an indigenous leader who is boots on the ground, is not leaving that area. And we're not just injecting cash or stuff and saying, here, ta-da, we've come as saviors to give you all of our stuff, when our stuff doesn't make sense long-term necessarily because it can't be supported. I think there's that heart for missions, back to like Bob Buford thing. He's like, I got this heart for mission. I think I should sell it all. No, you should use it. And so he used it to then create a space to help churches get outside of the church paradigm and go help connect them with resources so they can even understand that their missions program is ineffectual. It's actually sometimes creating more problems than it's helping. I think there's a book called When Helping Hurts, which is one of the things that we had learned about. So it's really, I think, leveraging outside of these paradigms of this is the church, this is business, back into, I think, what Paul mentioned before, generosity and reciprocity, person to person, and getting really, really connected, much more connected than what we in the West are used to when it comes to missions, where once a year the missionary parades around and says, here's all the things we did, and can we count on your support for next year? And then the church is, here's $1,000, good luck. And off they go. It's much more connected and boots on the ground, people to people, which I think is the more like business as mission. And instead of seeing two different things, mission and marketplace.
Yeah, I think sometimes that scripture that says they sold what they had and they laid it at the feet of the apostles, I believe that's what needs to happen. I don't believe they sold everything they had. I believe they sold whatever their excess was, because they still had to continue. They still needed capital to generate the funds that they created the excess with. Because if you give everything away, you can't regenerate the excess. And so I think that's also something we got to be careful of, is not to give yourself into a situation where you're going to be stuck in a hole and not able to generate that again. And even this friend of mine, I had to really, I also believe one of the reasons God put me in his life is he's the type of person, he did a deal, he brought Pepsi into South Africa, and I think his commission was like 60 million on that deal or something. He just said he doesn't want it because he's not interested in money. And a lot of people got upset with him because they said you could have, if you didn't want it, you could have used that money for nonprofit or for projects or for people that did need it. And I think sometimes we also get this mentality that because we're in ministry, we can't have money, or we need to live by faith. We need to be poor. But Abraham was one of the wealthiest guys, around, and so was Job. And we know the story of Joseph. And so, yeah, and it's like you said, God told the one guy, he didn't tell everybody. And the life we've lived the last couple of years is because the Lord spoke very specifically for us. But that's not my advice to people. If that's what God's saying to you, fine, but just make sure you're hearing well, because if you're not hearing well, it's going to be tough. Because it's already tough, even when you hear. Cliche, God gives the provision where he gives the vision. But that provision is not always money. It's also grace to endure that faith lifestyle, and to not lose yourself and go crazy and get all traumatized, because it's not just you have a family to look after and children. And the other side of the comment that I can add on to what you were talking about is, I always say to people, if you're going to partner with me, just don't be nonchalant about it, because you might feel after 3 months, I don't feel like giving, but there's somebody 3 months down the line that's going to be expecting that food to come, and it's not going to come again. So I also just think sometimes people just need to be sober in the way they approach these things, and just, if you're going to commit, then commit. And because there's families that are not going to eat if you don't give that much, type of thing. And my model, especially locally, is people say they want to help. I'm like, I don't want your money. Why don't you come with me? I'll take you into the rural areas. I'll take you to the old people. I'll take you to the disabled children. I'll say, you meet the family for yourself. Meet 10 families. And you see where your heart is reaching towards. And then you give whatever you want to the family. Don't give it to me, because all it does is it creates admin for me. And then I've got to redistribute. And not that I'm not willing to do that, I'll do it. But I just like that. I also want people to feel like they're doing something in the kingdom. If you just sit in church and you give $10, you give $10. You don't really feel the impact. You don't really see the impact. But when you meet the people and you see the change it's making in their lives, it's just does something differently to you. What I've also noticed is not many people even want to do that. A lot of people just want to give their money. They don't want to give their time. And often people know what we do, and they'll say, look, can we come and join you? And then I'm like, well, I can first go talk to your pastor, because I don't want it to look like I'm taking other people's ministries. They know me, tell them, they know what I'm doing. So first go speak to them. And a lot of churches will say, no, don't go, because it's almost like they're worried that people are going to connect with us. But I don't really have a church. I have church at the shelter, and I did that. And there's a reason why we did that, because we want to work with everybody. It's not your sheep, it's God's sheep. But we're not interested in stealing your sheep. The more hands we can get, the better. And the more people we can get with boots on the ground, the more rewarding the experience is for people. But it takes commitment in terms of time and resources.
There's a story that comes to mind from the sages of Judaism, where there was a judge who was waiting for a bus on a rainy day, and he had an umbrella. And a man approached to wait for the bus, and he didn't have one, so the judge shared his umbrella with him. And then the bus eventually showed up, and they both went where they were going. The judge sits down to preside over his court. In his first case, the man who he shared the umbrella with is the defendant. And the judge says, I must now recuse myself from judging this case. Why? Because I shared my umbrella with him. And you would think, no, it should be the opposite, right? It should be if the man had shared his umbrella with the judge because he didn't have one, then he would have sensed an indebtedness to him. But the fact is that when we give generously to someone else, in this case, the mere act of sharing the umbrella, we deepen the bond we have with them, and therefore we feel like giving them even more. Incentivizes us to keep
It's
giving.
very true. It's very true.
So here's the problem with that. Giving people, just writing a check, or even showing up and giving of your time, can end up being very unidirectional,
Mhm.
which is one reason, if it was me, I would much rather be going after helping people who are struggling by offering them work with which they support themselves, because then I get something out of it too, and it balances the equation. It balances the tension in between. Now, people have historically written that off. That's cruel. You don't understand. I'm not talking about asking an 84-year-old woman to come and work for you. I get that. I'm not talking about somebody who is, has lost a leg, doing physical labor, though somebody in that situation could probably do something on a computer if you've got that kind of work for them. But what I am saying is, many years ago, we had a president by the name of Ronald Reagan, and he said the best for poverty is to get a job.
Yeah.
It is. And that sounds a little harsh. It's tough love. Yeah, but it's true. It doesn't mean it's not true.
Yes.
And I just if it was me today doing that, and as a matter of fact, this is what I did in my agency, not with people who were poor, but I did it for people who were quite a bit younger than me and brand new young adults, not knowing what they were doing and struggling to try and figure out their careers. And I had writing work in my agency that needed to be done. And these were a group of young, talented people who could write well. And so I offered them a culture and I offered them paid work. And I saw substantive and substantial change in their lives. They matured quickly. They understood the world better. They started believing in themselves more. And they didn't need me to write that next check, because they started getting work from elsewhere. And or some of them, this isn't really for me, but I found a great job. Okay, that's great too. I found a great job that's going to pay my bills. And some of them got married and bought houses. And these are young people in their early to mid 20s. This is not established 44-year-olds like me.
Oh.
Not pushing aside or rejecting the nonprofit or church ministry thing, but just to say that just because it doesn't have the label on it doesn't mean you're doing the work. Jason said earlier, if you're doing it through an auto mechanic shop, you're still doing it.
Yes. The separating the heart from the tactical endpoint, the place where we interact, the transaction.
Look, it's very difficult. You've got a lot for people. It's actually a skill that God needs to teach you, especially if you do counseling. When you start out counseling, you tend to get emotionally involved with the people that you're counseling because you have a heart for people, and you'll never be able to keep that because it will actually traumatize you at the end of the day. If you just talk to people the whole day with problems and traumas and you identify with that emotion. And so even with counseling, there's got to be a level where you can't put yourself emotionally in that person's place. You've got to sit outside of the chaos, outside of the trauma, and you've got to minister out of the Holy Spirit into their life. You can't put yourself in their life. It doesn't work. And I think it's the same thing with what you're talking about. And I've also noticed there's, even at the shelter church every Sunday, there's certain people that will very faithfully come every single Sunday. And the trend I've seen is the ones that come every Sunday, Christians that I can see that they're turned on a Sunday and they're applying it, they're actually meditating on it, they're thinking about it. Those guys tend to leave the shop and they tend to get jobs or find little places to stay. And I test this over and over. I'll say to them, okay, guys, this is what Ephesians 1 says. This is the prayer we need to pray. That God fills us with spirit of wisdom, revelation, having the eyes of our understanding enlightened, so that we know what the hope of our calling is, what is our inheritance, the saints. And I say, if you pray that every day for 3 months, I guarantee you, your life will change. If you pray that every day for a year, I guarantee you, you will probably be in a job earning a salary, and you'll be out of the position And next Sunday you come there and you say, "We prayed the prayer." Nobody. One guy puts his hand up. I say to them, I talk to them about purpose and calling, and I say to them, okay, let's make this real. If money wasn't an object, later I came to you and I said, money is no object. I gave you $100 million. What would you do? Where's your passion? Who would you help with that? What would it look like? And I say to them, go write that vision down. And then if you give me your vision, I'll translate it into a mission for you. How do we accomplish that vision? And it's like sometimes you come there and it's like maybe one guy's done it and others just, and it's not always that you're dealing with bad people or lazy people. Sometimes these people are just so overwhelmed with their life that they can't go there.
Yeah.
And you've got to constantly be doing that. And that's why the guys that come regularly and are faithful, that's why there's a different switch that happens in them, because eventually the penny drops. So it's also just being consistent in that. And a lot of guys will say to you, I don't want a job and I don't want help because I'm happy to beg.
It underscores, I think, the importance of being closely connected to the people who are being helped. The further the distance, the simpler the issue. So a church doesn't in the Midwest of the United States, doesn't have any understanding about that individual and what they're going through and what they actually need. The church is going to be like, hey, how can we systematize this? Because that's just what the United States does. We'll systematize that Coke drive or the food drive or whatever it is, and have no idea that how it's being used or misused down on the ground and whether that help is even necessary. It's just totally lost because of the distance. So we're at the end of our time here for the Tuesday workshop. Sitting here talking with our new friend, Bernie. Welcome, Bernie. I'm so happy that you were able to join us to talk about mission and marketplace with our faculty member, Paul Edwards. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
Catch us every Tuesday at 10 p.m. Central Time, or 10 a.m. rather, Central Time. Bernie, you're in the evening hours. They're in the PM hours. You around the planet. Glad to have you with us. 10 a.m. Central Time on Tuesdays for the Thinker Business Accelerator workshop. We talk about matters of faith and business. And it's our belief that if you have a product, service, or message that you think can change the world, you got to get good at sharing that message or selling that product or service. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.